He was just doing his rounds when he stumbled upon an old cart with sealed barrels in the forest. No one knew they were there, and no one wanted them to be opened. One decision could save the forest or destroy it forever. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Ethan Caldwell began his mornings the same way he had for years, with habits shaped not by preference, but by necessity. The forest did not care for improvisation. It rewarded consistency and punished distraction. And Ethan had learned that lesson early in his career, long before the lines on his face deepened, and the optimism that once followed him into the field thinned into something quieter and more durable. He woke before sunrise, checked the weather twice from 2 different sources, packed his kit in the same order every day, and logged his planned route into the system, even when he knew no one would look at it unless something went wrong. His district lay far from visitor centers and scenic overlooks. There were no marked trails meant for hikers, no picnic tables, no interpretive signs explaining the names of trees. It was a working forest, at least on paper, divided into numbered sectors and management zones that shifted with policy and budget cycles. Fires were the constant threat here, more feared than poachers or storms, and most of Ethan's days were spent checking moisture levels, clearing deadfall from access routes, and making sure old fire breaks had not been reclaimed by brush. That morning was no different. The air was cool, but already carried the faint dryness that came before summer, and the soil under his boots gave just enough to remind him how quickly conditions could change. He moved steadily, not rushing, not lingering, eyes trained on the ground and the canopy in equal measure. Experience had taught him that danger rarely announced itself. It appeared as a subtle inconsistency, a fallen tree where there should have been none, a change in bird activity, a smell that did not belong. By late morning, he reached the boundary between 2 sectors, one of which had not been formally reassessed in years. It was the kind of place supervisors forgot about because nothing dramatic ever happened there. No fires, no accidents, no headlines. Ethan preferred these stretches of forest. They demanded attention without spectacle, and they suited a man who had grown wary of noise. He paused to compare his digital map with the older paper version folded in his pack, more out of habit than necessity. The 2 did not always agree, and when they didn't, it was usually the older map that told the truer story. As he adjusted his course slightly to follow a shallow ridge, he noticed something that made him stop. Light. Not the broken, filtered light that slipped between branches everywhere else, but a broader wash, steady and pale, as though the forest had opened its hand. He frowned and checked the map again. There was no clearing marked within half a mile in any direction. He knew this terrain well enough to trust his memory, and his memory insisted there should have been nothing ahead but dense growth and uneven ground. Curiosity alone would not have been enough to pull him off his route. Curiosity without purpose was how people got lost. But curiosity combined with inconsistency was another matter entirely. Ethan adjusted his pack and moved toward the light, careful to mark his deviation in his notebook, even though no regulation required him to do so. The forest thickened briefly, then gave way without warning. The clearing was not large, but it was precise. The grass that covered it was low and even, interrupted only by patches of moss that clung close to the soil. There was no underbrush, no fallen branches, none of the debris that usually collected wherever trees receded. The surrounding trunks formed a near-perfect ring, spaced closely enough to suggest intention rather than chance. Ethan stood at the edge for a long moment, scanning the perimeter, his senses sharpening as they always did when something refused to fit into a known pattern. And then he saw the wagon. It stood near the center of the clearing, angled slightly as though it had been positioned rather than abandoned. A wooden horse-drawn wagon, old enough that its shape belonged more to photographs than memory, yet intact in a way that immediately unsettled him. The wheels were weathered, but sound, their rims darkened by age rather than rot. The body of the wagon bore the marks of time, but not of collapse. It had not sunk into the ground, had not tipped or cracked. It stood as if waiting. Inside the wagon were barrels, 4 of them, uniform in size and construction, set snugly against one another. They were coated in moss and lichen, the kind that grew slowly and undisturbed, and their iron hoops were dulled, but unbroken. Ethan approached carefully, aware that the clearing carried no echoes, no birdsong, nothing but the faint whisper of wind moving through the trees at its edge. He did not touch the barrels at first. He circled the wagon, noting details as his training demanded. There were no drag marks in the grass, no sign of wheels having passed through recently or long ago. The ground showed no ruts, no compacted earth that would have suggested regular access. The wagon should not have been able to reach this place without leaving a trace. Yet here it was. Ethan crouched and examined the grass beneath the wheels. It was pressed down, yes, but not torn or churned. It had grown around the shape of the wood, accommodating it over time. This wagon had not been dropped here. It had been placed, and it had stayed. He straightened slowly, a familiar tension settling into his shoulders. Abandoned equipment was not unusual in old forests. He had seen rusted machinery swallowed by trees, forgotten tools buried under leaf litter. But this was different. This was preservation without protection, concealment without burial. He took out his GPS unit and confirmed his coordinates again. The device insisted he stood in an unremarkable section of forest, one without features, one without history. The paper map said the same. The clearing, the wagon, the barrels were not mistakes on the ground. They were omissions on the page. Ethan photographed the scene from several angles, careful to include reference points at the tree line. He made no attempt to open the barrels or climb onto the wagon. Regulations were clear about handling unknown objects, but more than that, instinct told him restraint mattered here. Whatever this was, it had endured precisely because it had not been disturbed. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to other discoveries he had reported over the years. Most had ended the same way: a form submitted, an acknowledgement received, and then silence. Sometimes, weeks later, he would return to a site only to find it empty, cleared with a thoroughness that discouraged questions. Official explanations were vague, and no one ever followed up with him. He looked around the clearing again, this time not as a ranger, but as a witness. The symmetry of the trees, the dryness of the ground, the way the barrels were sealed, not hastily but with care. This was not negligence. This was intent. Ethan sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and wrote in his notebook, his handwriting deliberate. He described the wagon, the barrels, the absence of access routes. He noted the condition of the materials, the apparent age, the lack of disturbance. He avoided speculation, sticking to observable facts, but the weight of those facts pressed against the edges of his mind. He knew what protocol demanded next. He also knew what experience suggested would happen if he followed it too quickly. By the time he packed his notebook away and prepared to leave, the clearing no longer felt like a curiosity. It felt like a responsibility. He took one last look at the wagon, standing patiently in its circle of trees, and felt a quiet certainty take hold. Whatever lay within those barrels was not meant to be found easily, and it was not meant to be handled carelessly. As he retraced his steps back into the forest, the light from the clearing faded behind him, swallowed once more by branches and shadow. But the image remained, sharp and persistent, refusing to settle into the category of things he could forget. The forest closed around him as if nothing had changed. Yet with every step back toward his assigned route, Ethan understood that something had shifted. Not in the land itself, perhaps, but in his place within it. The clearing might not exist on any map, but it now existed in him, and he knew that whatever came next would grow outward from that quiet, impossible circle of trees. Ethan did not return to the clearing the next day. That decision, made quietly and without ceremony, marked the first true deviation from his routine. He told himself it was practical, that a single discovery should not distort an entire schedule. But the truth was simpler and more troubling. He needed distance. Not from the forest, which remained constant and indifferent, but from the certainty that had begun to form too quickly in his mind. Instead, he spent the morning completing tasks that required little thought. He checked moisture sensors along a shallow ravine, recorded wind exposure near an old fire break, and cleared debris from a service road that no one had driven in years. His hands moved automatically, trained by repetition, while his thoughts returned again and again to the image of the wagon standing in its silent circle of trees. By midday, he gave up the pretense of distraction and returned to the ranger station, a modest structure that blended into the landscape as intentionally as the clearing concealed itself. The building held little more than maps, archived reports, and a workstation that connected him to a system far removed from the ground he walked every day. It was there, surrounded by paper and screens, that Ethan began to understand the nature of what he had found. He started with the maps, not the current digital overlays, which he already knew would tell him nothing new, but the older ones stored in flat drawers that smelled faintly of dust and ink. These were maps drawn by hand, revised over decades, annotated by rangers long retired or dead. They told a slower story of the land, one written before efficiency replaced observation. He worked methodically, comparing grid lines, tracing contours with his finger, noting where details had been added and where they had been removed. After nearly an hour, he found it. A faint marking, barely visible beneath later revisions, indicated a small clearing in the approximate location he had visited. Next to it was a notation so light it might have been erased deliberately. A single word, followed by a date. Temporary. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Temporary features were not uncommon during survey work or logging operations, but they were usually removed from maps only after the land had returned to a natural state. This clearing had not. It had been maintained without maintenance, preserved without presence. He turned to the reports associated with that period. The early 20th century was poorly documented in the station's archives, but enough remained to suggest patterns. There were references to exploratory work, to assessments commissioned by private interests rather than the state. Names appeared without context, initials without explanation, and then, as suddenly as they began, the entries stopped. No conclusions. No closure. Ethan closed the folder and rubbed his eyes. The forest outside the station was quiet, its sounds filtered through glass and distance. He felt the familiar pull of the field, the urge to return to the clearing and look again, this time with the weight of history pressing against his observations. By early afternoon, he had made up his mind. The return trip felt shorter, though he knew the distance had not changed. He moved with purpose, his awareness sharpened not by urgency, but by resolve. When the clearing emerged once more from the surrounding trees, it looked exactly as it had before, untouched and patient. This time, Ethan approached the wagon directly. He examined the barrels with greater care, crouching low and brushing aside a thin layer of moss to reveal the wood beneath. The staves were old-growth timber, cut cleanly and shaped precisely. He recognized the craftsmanship immediately. These were not crude containers meant for transport alone. They were built for protection. The lids were sealed with a mixture of resin and wax, applied thickly and evenly. Time had darkened the surface, but it had not cracked or peeled. Ethan traced the edge of one seal with a gloved finger and felt its firmness. Whoever had closed these barrels had expected them to remain closed for a very long time. He moved on to the markings. Burned into the wood near the base of each barrel were symbols and numbers that had been partially obscured by growth. Ethan cleaned one carefully, revealing a sequence that stirred recognition. He had seen similar markings before, not in the field, but in photographs of archived geological equipment. These were identification codes, not inventory numbers. They were meant to track samples, not property. That realization shifted something inside him. Barrels used for storage could contain anything. Barrels used for sampling contained information, evidence extracted from the earth itself, and information, unlike material goods, retained its value regardless of age. Ethan stepped back and considered the clearing anew. The choice of location made sense now. Dry ground, stable temperature, minimal exposure. The barrels had been placed where decay would be slow and interference unlikely. The wagon itself served as both transport and signal, a marker visible only to those who knew where to look. He resisted the temptation to open one of the barrels. The thought crossed his mind more than once, accompanied by the practical argument that a brief inspection would clarify everything. But another voice, quieter and more insistent, warned him that clarity came at a cost. Once opened, the barrels could no longer be what they were. Sealed testimony, unaltered by modern hands. Ethan documented everything he could without breaking that seal. He measured distances, noted orientations, photographed markings. He recorded the way the clearing drained after a light rain, how the grass bent but did not break beneath his boots. These details, mundane on their own, formed a pattern that told him the truth he needed to hear. This was not a forgotten mistake. This was a deliberate pause. As evening approached, the forest shifted subtly, light thinning and shadows lengthening. Ethan packed his equipment slowly, aware that each moment spent here deepened his connection to the place. Before leaving, he placed a small, unobtrusive marker at the edge of the clearing, one that only another ranger would recognize. Not a claim, not a warning, but a sign of attention. The walk back to the station was quieter than before. The forest seemed unchanged, yet Ethan felt the difference in himself. He was no longer simply a caretaker of land. He was a custodian of something left unresolved, a witness to a decision made long before he was born. That night, he wrote his report carefully. He described the clearing, the wagon, the barrels. He noted their condition, their apparent age, their markings. He avoided interpretation, just as regulations required. But he chose his words with precision, emphasizing the absence of access routes, the intentional placement, the integrity of the seals. When he finished, he did not submit the report. Instead, he saved it locally and closed the system. He understood now that timing mattered as much as accuracy. To act too quickly would be to surrender control. To wait too long would invite others to act without him. As he turned off the lights and stepped outside, the forest greeted him with the familiar chorus of night. Somewhere within its vastness, the clearing remained, unchanged and unseen, holding its quiet burden. Ethan knew that he could not carry that burden alone for long, and as the thought settled, so did another, equally inevitable. There were others who would recognize the significance of those barrels the moment they saw them, people whose knowledge came not from stewardship, but from profit and precedent. It was only a matter of time before one of them came looking. Ethan did not reach out to Michael Ridge immediately. The name had surfaced in his thoughts the moment he recognized the markings on the barrels, but recognition alone was not reason enough to act. Over the years, Ethan had learned that some connections, once reestablished, could not be undone. They carried expectations with them, histories that complicated clean decisions. Still, as the days passed, and the clearing remained undisturbed, the sense that the matter extended beyond his solitary authority grew harder to ignore. Michael had once worked the same district, years before Ethan assumed responsibility for it. They had overlapped briefly, long enough to share patrols and long conversations during slow afternoons, when the forest offered nothing urgent, and men spoke more freely than they intended. Michael had been sharp, observant, impatient with bureaucracy, and deeply interested in what lay beneath the surface of the land. Where Ethan focused on the present condition of the forest, Michael had always been drawn to its past and its potential. That difference had never caused friction between them, but it had shaped the paths they eventually took. When Michael left the service, the official explanation was unremarkable: a disagreement over priorities, a better opportunity elsewhere. Ethan had not pressed for details at the time. He had assumed, perhaps naively, that Michael would return to private life and fade into memory, another capable ranger worn down by the slow grind of institutional compromise. Now, years later, Ethan found himself staring at Michael's contact information on an old list, his hesitation reflected in the stillness of the station around him. The clearing, the barrels, the markings all pointed toward knowledge that did not belong to him alone. And Michael, whether by chance or design, occupied a position that bridged past and present in a way no one else he knew did. The call went through on the third ring. Michael's voice was unchanged, brisk and measured, as if conversation were a transaction to be completed efficiently. He sounded neither surprised nor pleased to hear from Ethan, only attentive. Ethan kept the exchange brief, careful not to reveal more than necessary. He mentioned a discovery, something old, something that might interest someone with geological expertise. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to register, and then Michael agreed to come see it. He arrived 2 days later, driving a vehicle that bore no official markings. Ethan watched from the edge of the clearing as Michael stepped out, his posture alert, his gaze already scanning the trees. The forest did not acknowledge him any differently than it had Ethan, but the effect of his presence was immediate. Where Ethan felt responsibility, Michael brought intention. They did not exchange pleasantries. Ethan led the way into the clearing, saying nothing until the wagon came into view. He did not need to watch Michael's face to know when recognition set in. He felt it in the sudden stillness beside him, in the way Michael slowed without conscious effort, as though approaching something fragile. Michael walked around the wagon once, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes taking in details Ethan had already memorized. He did not touch the barrels. He did not ask permission to inspect them. He simply observed, his expression settling into something between calculation and restraint. "These are sealed properly," he said at last, his voice low. "Not improvised, not rushed." Ethan waited. Michael crouched near one barrel, brushing aside moss with the edge of his sleeve. He uncovered a marking and nodded slightly, as if confirming a private suspicion. When he stood again, he looked at Ethan with an intensity that made the clearing feel suddenly smaller. "You shouldn't open these," he said. The statement was not framed as advice. It was not a warning either. It was an assertion, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the conclusion was already obvious. Ethan asked the question he had been holding since the beginning. He asked what they were. Michael exhaled slowly and shook his head. "What they contain matters less than what they represent," he said. "These were never meant to be forgotten. They were meant to be delayed." They moved away from the wagon, standing near the edge of the clearing where the trees pressed close. Michael spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed just enough without committing him to anything concrete. He described early exploratory efforts, privately funded, undertaken before environmental oversight carried real authority. He spoke of samples taken from depth, of findings that complicated easy profit, of reports that raised as many concerns as opportunities. "There are places where the ground gives generously," Michael said, "and there are places where it gives conditionally. Take too much, disturb the wrong layer, and you don't just extract value. You release consequences. Ethan listened, his mind returning to the maps, the faint notation marked temporary, the sudden silence in the archival record. He asked why the barrels had been left here, why they had not been destroyed or secured elsewhere. Michael's gaze drifted back to the wagon. Because this place was the safest option, he said. Not legally, practically. Dry, stable, inaccessible, hidden in plain sight. And now? Ethan asked. Michael met his eyes. Now it's a problem. The admission hung between them. Michael did not deny his connection to the discovery, nor did he clarify it. Instead, he shifted the conversation to the present, to the realities Ethan knew all too well. The district had been flagged for review. Contractors were eager to redefine its status. Data, especially old data, could be repurposed, reframed, stripped of inconvenient context. If this becomes official, Michael continued, it won't stay in your hands. It will move fast. Faster than you can influence. Ethan heard the implication clearly. Disclosure, once initiated, could not be controlled. The barrels, sealed and inert as they were, represented a threshold. On one side lay uncertainty, containment, time. On the other lay extraction, justification, irreversible change. Michael did not ask Ethan to conceal the discovery outright. He did not threaten or bribe him. Instead, he offered a quieter alternative. He suggested patience, suggested that some things were better, left as they were, unrecorded and undisturbed. You protect the forest by not drawing attention to it, Michael said. Sometimes silence does more good than any report. Ethan felt the weight of that argument. It aligned uncomfortably well with his own doubts, with the knowledge of how often official processes failed the land they claimed to manage. Yet something in Michael's certainty troubled him. It carried an edge of ownership, as though the clearing and its contents belonged not to the forest or the public, but to a narrative Michael was determined to preserve. They stood together for a long moment, the clearing quiet around them. When Ethan finally spoke, he did not address Michael's suggestion directly. He asked instead about Michael's current work, about the nature of his consulting role. Michael did not hesitate. He explained that he advised on geological risk assessment, on feasibility studies, on how to interpret data in ways that aligned with project goals. He did not disguise the fact that those goals were commercial, nor did he express shame. In his view, knowledge existed to be used, and responsibility lay in how it was managed, not whether it was revealed. Before leaving, Michael returned his attention to the wagon one last time. "You did the right thing by calling me," he said. "But understand this. The moment this enters the system, it stops being about stewardship. It becomes about leverage." He did not wait for a response. He walked back toward his vehicle, his footsteps unhurried, his posture unchanged. Ethan watched him go, the sense of unease deepening with every step. After Michael left, the clearing felt altered, not physically but conceptually. It was no longer a solitary anomaly. It was a point of intersection between competing visions of the land, between restraint and ambition, between protection and use. Ethan remained there until the light began to fade, his thoughts circling the same realization. Michael had not come here to help him understand the barrels. He had come to make sure they stayed closed. As Ethan turned back toward the forest path, he knew that waiting, too, was a decision, and decisions, once made, had a way of attracting consequences. After Michael Ridge left the clearing, the forest did not immediately return to its previous stillness. The air felt heavier, as though something intangible had been introduced and now lingered between the trees. Ethan remained where he was long after the sound of the vehicle faded, standing near the wagon with his hands resting loosely at his sides, aware that the discovery had crossed an invisible threshold. What had once been a solitary responsibility was now shared by forces he did not control, and that knowledge settled into him with a quiet, persistent weight. In the days that followed, nothing happened at first. The clearing remained undisturbed. The wagon stood as it always had, patient and unchanged. The barrels stayed sealed, their surfaces slowly reclaiming the moss that Ethan's careful inspection had disturbed. If not for the conversation with Michael, Ethan might have believed he had imagined the sense of urgency altogether. But pressure rarely announces itself directly. It gathers in subtle shifts, in small alterations to routines that once seemed fixed. The first sign came in the form of an email forwarded from the regional office, routine in tone and content. A scheduled review of land use classifications was being moved forward. The language was bureaucratic and vague, filled with phrases that suggested efficiency rather than intent. But Ethan recognized the implication immediately. His district, long ignored because it produced no immediate returns, had come back into focus. A week later, he encountered survey markers where none had been before. Bright flags tied to saplings along an old service route, their color jarring against the subdued greens and browns of the forest. He followed them for nearly half a mile before they disappeared again into dense growth. The markers were not random. They outlined potential access corridors, tentative but deliberate. Ethan documented them as required, photographing their placement and recording their coordinates. The act felt hollow. He knew these records would be interpreted not as warnings, but as confirmations. Evidence that the land was ready to be measured, divided, and repurposed. At the station, the atmosphere shifted as well. Calls from supervisors became more frequent, their questions more pointed. They asked about conditions on the ground, about obstacles to development, about anything that might delay progress. They did not mention the clearing or the wagon directly, but Ethan sensed the narrowing of focus, the way attention moved closer without revealing its target. When he raised concerns about ecological sensitivity, about the risks of disturbing long, stable ground layers, he was met with polite acknowledgement and little else. The language of caution had grown familiar to the system, and familiarity had dulled its impact. Michael reached out again during this period, his tone unchanged from their last meeting. He spoke as though they were collaborators navigating an inconvenient situation together, rather than men standing on opposite sides of an impending decision. He mentioned the accelerated timelines casually, as if they were weather patterns beyond anyone's control. "You can feel it building," Michael said. "That's how these things go. Momentum starts somewhere, and then it carries everyone with it." Ethan asked what role Michael intended to play. Michael did not answer directly. He spoke instead about feasibility studies, about risk assessments, framed to emphasize manageable uncertainty. He spoke of how data, once contextualized properly, could justify almost any course of action. The implication was clear. If the contents of the barrels ever entered official discourse, they would not be treated as warnings. They would be treated as opportunities. The offer came shortly after, delivered without drama or overt coercion. They met not at the clearing, but at a roadside turnout, a place neutral enough to suggest coincidence. Michael was precise in his wording, careful to avoid statements that could be interpreted as instructions. He spoke of resolutions, of ways problems were quietly absorbed by the system rather than confronted. He suggested that the wagon could be classified as abandoned debris, its contents removed under standard remediation procedures. The barrels, he said, could be transferred elsewhere for proper handling, their significance preserved without complicating the status of the land. "You wouldn't be falsifying anything," Michael said. "You'd simply be allowing the process to move forward without interference." Ethan listened, his expression neutral, his thoughts turning inward. He understood the logic. He understood the appeal of disengagement, of stepping aside, and allowing larger mechanisms to decide outcomes beyond his influence. He also understood what would follow. Once removed, the barrels would cease to exist as they did now. Their context would be stripped away, their meaning redefined by those with the loudest voice and the clearest financial interest. He declined without dramatics, offering no counter-proposal, no argument. Michael accepted the refusal with a nod that suggested he had anticipated it. They parted without hostility, but the distance between them widened into something more permanent. Pressure intensified after that. A formal notice arrived, informing Ethan that his district would soon receive an influx of external personnel for preliminary assessments. The language emphasized cooperation and efficiency. It did not invite dissent. He was instructed to provide access, guidance, and support as needed. Ethan walked the forest more frequently now, his patrols extending beyond necessity. He revisited the clearing often, sometimes standing at its edge for long minutes without entering, as though proximity alone could alter its fate. He thought about the barrels, about the information sealed within them, and about the precarious balance between revelation and restraint. At night, sleep came unevenly. His thoughts replayed conversations, documents, half-forgotten clauses buried in regulatory texts. He knew the system well enough to recognize its weaknesses, its blind spots, the spaces where procedure could be used, not to expedite change, but to slow it. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually, a convergence of memory and necessity. Ethan recalled a rarely cited provision in the statutes governing land management, one that addressed not resources, but artifacts, not extraction, but preservation. The law acknowledged that certain discoveries, by virtue of their context and integrity, warranted protection regardless of their material value. The provision was obscure, often overlooked, because it complicated development rather than facilitating it. It required time, documentation, and coordination across agencies that preferred to operate independently. It was not designed for dramatic intervention. It was designed to delay. Delay, Ethan understood, was precisely what the clearing needed. He began preparing quietly. He reviewed legal texts late into the night, tracing precedents, noting language that could not be easily dismissed. He gathered his documentation, refining it to emphasize patterns rather than conclusions. He focused on the clearing itself, on its absence from modern maps, on the preservation of the wagon and barrels as a single, undisturbed complex. When survey teams arrived, he accompanied them with professional detachment, guiding them along approved routes that skirted the clearing without revealing it directly. He did not lie. He did not fabricate obstacles. He simply managed information with the care it deserved. Michael noticed. Their conversations grew shorter, more cautious. He warned Ethan once, quietly, that patience could be mistaken for obstruction. Ethan accepted the warning without response. He had reached a point where fear of consequence no longer outweighed clarity of purpose. The forest continued its indifferent cycle around them. Leaves unfurled, insects returned, the ground warmed and dried. The clearing remained unchanged, its quiet persistence a reminder that not all truths demanded exposure. By the time Ethan submitted his preliminary report to initiate the next stage of review, he knew there would be no turning back. The process he was invoking would frustrate those who sought swift resolution. It would attract scrutiny from multiple directions. It would not guarantee preservation, but it would force deliberation. As he pressed send, he felt neither triumph nor relief, only a measured acceptance of what lay ahead. Pressure would continue. That much was certain. But for the first time since discovering the clearing, Ethan understood that pressure could be redirected, diffused through channels designed to resist haste. Outside the station, the forest waited, unconcerned with timelines or approvals. And within it, the clearing held its ground, a quiet axis around which competing intentions now turned. The report Ethan submitted did not look like an act of defiance. That was its strength. It was written in the same measured language he had used for years, shaped by regulations and precedent, restrained by the expectation that facts should speak without ornament. Anyone reading it quickly would find nothing provocative in its tone. Anyone reading it carefully would recognize that it did something far more disruptive than protest. It slowed everything down. He framed the clearing not as a discovery of potential value, but as an anomaly of preservation. He described the absence of access routes in precise terms, documenting soil composition, vegetation patterns, and the unbroken continuity of growth around the site. He emphasized the wagon and the barrels not as containers of unknown contents, but as a single intact assemblage whose significance lay in its undisturbed state. The language mattered. Objects could be moved. Context could not. Ethan cited the obscure statute he had spent nights revisiting, the one few administrators remembered, and even fewer liked to apply. It addressed historical and scientific complexes that had survived outside formal records, structures, or artifacts, whose value derived from their relationship to the land rather than from any single component. The statute did not require immediate classification or excavation. It required assessment, consultation, and preservation pending determination. It was, by design, inconvenient. He sent the documentation not to a single authority but to several. One copy went to the Regional Land Management Office, another to a State Historical Review Board, a third to an independent academic archive that specialized in early industrial fieldwork. Each packet contained the same careful descriptions, the same photographs, the same emphasis on integrity over interpretation. No single recipient held the full narrative, but together they formed a web that could not be easily bypassed. Once the reports were submitted, Ethan felt an unexpected quiet settle over him. Not relief exactly, but a sense of having stepped out of direct confrontation. He had not accused anyone. He had not exposed secrets or made demands. He had simply invoked a process that required patience and accountability. What followed would unfold beyond his immediate control, but it would unfold slowly, and that slowness was intentional. The response was not immediate. Systems that prided themselves on efficiency often moved slowly when confronted with ambiguity. Questions circulated. Requests for clarification arrived. Ethan answered each one with precision, never volunteering more than was asked, never retreating into vagueness. He let the facts accumulate, trusting their weight. Survey activity near the clearing halted without announcement. The flags remained where they were, but no new ones appeared. Contractors who had once spoken confidently about timelines now spoke in conditional phrases, their certainty diluted by the need to wait for determinations outside their jurisdiction. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled. Emails grew longer and less decisive. Michael reached out again during this period, his tone markedly different from before. The confidence that had once underpinned his arguments had thinned into something more cautious. He asked what Ethan had done, though the question suggested he already knew the answer. "You've complicated this," Michael said, not unkindly. "You've brought in people who don't care about outcomes, only process." "That was the point," Ethan replied. Michael exhaled slowly. He did not argue. Instead, he spoke about delays, about how prolonged uncertainty could cause projects to collapse under their own weight. He framed it as concern, as though Ethan's actions endangered more than they protected. Ethan listened without interruption, aware that this was not persuasion so much as acknowledgement of loss. "The data won't disappear," Michael said finally. "Whatever's in those barrels, it'll surface eventually." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but not like this." The conversation ended there. Michael did not threaten him, did not attempt another compromise. When they parted, it was with the quiet understanding that their alignment had ended. They were no longer navigating the same future. As weeks passed, The clearing took on a new status, though no sign marked the change. It remained physically unchanged, but administratively it had become heavy with attention. Scholars requested site descriptions. Review boards asked for comparative analysis. Each inquiry reinforced the same principle. The value lay not in extraction, but in preservation. Ethan returned to the clearing often during this time, not to intervene, but to observe. He noticed details he had overlooked before. The way the wagon's shadow fell at different times of day, the resilience of the grass beneath its wheels, the subtle variations in moss growth across the barrel's surfaces. These were not just signs of age. They were evidence of continuity, of a long, unbroken relationship between object and place. He did not open the barrels. The thought arose occasionally, accompanied by curiosity and doubt, but it passed. Opening them would change their status irrevocably. Sealed, they were a question the system had to respect. Opened, they would become answers the system could manipulate. One afternoon, as autumn edged closer and the forest began its gradual shift, Ethan received confirmation that the clearing had been granted temporary protective designation, pending full interdisciplinary review. The designation did not guarantee permanence. It did not declare the site untouchable. But it did what Ethan had hoped. It created time. The contractor withdrew its equipment without ceremony. There was no confrontation, no admission of defeat. The project simply lost momentum, redirected toward areas where fewer complications awaited. Bureaucracy, when faced with resistance that could not be overruled, often chose avoidance. Michael left the region shortly after. Ethan learned of it indirectly, through an update circulated among agencies. Michael's consulting role had ended, not because of misconduct, but because the project no longer required his expertise. There was no scandal attached to his departure, no dramatic reckoning. He moved on, as he always had, toward opportunities that promised fewer constraints. Their final exchange came weeks later, brief and understated. Michael acknowledged the outcome without resentment. He did not congratulate Ethan, nor did he accuse him. He simply noted that some fights were won not by force, but by endurance. "You chose the long road," Michael said. Ethan did not deny it. When the call ended, Ethan stood outside the station and looked toward the forest, where the clearing lay hidden among trees that had seen countless decisions come and go. He felt no pride in what he had done, no sense of having prevailed. He felt only the quiet satisfaction of having acted in accordance with the land rather than against it. The decision he had made did not rely on bravery or sacrifice. It required patience, familiarity with systems others took for granted, and a willingness to let uncertainty remain unresolved. It was, in its way, an unremarkable choice, and that, Ethan knew, was why it had worked. The forest did not need a hero. It needed time. Time passed in the forest the way it always had, without ceremony and without regard for the urgency that humans attached to their decisions. Summer thinned into early autumn, and the first cold nights returned with a restraint that suggested patience rather than warning. Leaves changed color gradually, as though unwilling to draw attention to themselves, and the ground absorbed each fallen layer without complaint. For Ethan Caldwell, the absence of upheaval became the clearest sign that the path he had chosen was holding. The clearing did not change. That fact alone felt significant. No fences appeared at its edge. No signs announced its status. There were no markers warning of restricted access or promising future development. To anyone passing nearby, if anyone ever did, it remained exactly what it had been when Ethan first stepped into it. A quiet opening in the forest, a wagon standing among trees, barrels resting where they had rested for decades. The protection it now carried existed entirely on paper, embedded in correspondence, review schedules, and pending determinations that moved slowly through offices far removed from the land itself. Ethan continued his patrols as before, though the work felt subtly altered. He noticed how often his thoughts returned to the clearing, even when his route took him elsewhere. Not with anxiety, but with a sense of continuity, as though the place had become a fixed point by which everything else was measured. He checked moisture levels, inspected fire breaks, logged conditions, and filed reports. The forest responded as it always had, indifferent to his presence, untroubled by his concerns. The inquiries continued, but they lost their urgency. Academic reviewers requested clarifications and comparative data, their questions careful and methodical. Historical boards debated classification frameworks that had little precedent. Their discussions focused more on terminology than outcome. No one asked to open the barrels. No one insisted on immediate resolution. The uncertainty Ethan had deliberately introduced had done its work. From time to time, he returned to the clearing alone. He never stayed long. There was no need. He walked the perimeter, observed the wagon, and left without touching anything. Each visit reinforced the same impression. The site did not demand intervention. It endured. Michael Ridge did not return. Ethan learned of Michael's departure indirectly, through the kind of administrative update that reduced complex human decisions to a single line of text. Consulting contract concluded. Services no longer required. There was no mention of disagreement, no indication of conflict. Michael had simply moved on, as people in his position often did, toward projects less encumbered by hesitation. Their final conversation lingered in Ethan's memory, not because of anything dramatic that had been said, but because of what had not. Michael had understood the outcome before it fully materialized. He had recognized the power of delay, even if he could not accept it. In a system built on momentum, delay was a form of resistance that left no obvious target. Ethan did not resent him. If anything, he understood him more clearly now. Michael had believed in the inevitability of use, in the idea that land existed to be interpreted through potential rather than presence. Ethan, by contrast, had come to believe that some value lay precisely in what was not extracted, in what remained intact, not because it was hidden, but because it was allowed to stay. The barrels remained sealed. That fact became quietly central to the clearing's identity. Scholars speculated cautiously in correspondence, careful not to frame hypotheses as conclusions. The integrity of the seals was cited repeatedly as evidence of deliberate preservation rather than abandonment. The barrel's contents, whatever they were, receded in importance as the act of leaving them untouched gained prominence. The site was no longer discussed as a repository of information, but as an example of restraint. Ethan recognized the irony. By refusing to open the barrels, he had ensured they mattered more than they ever would have as data points. Their silence carried weight. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow fell before the end of October, light and dry, dusting the forest without obscuring it. The clearing transformed subtly, its grass bending beneath frost, the wagon's wooden frame darkening with moisture before freezing solid. The barrels took on a muted sheen, their surfaces unchanged beneath a thin layer of ice. Ethan visited once after the first snowfall, his footsteps the only marks on the clearing's surface. He stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, and watched the way snow gathered unevenly around the wheels. The forest was utterly still, the kind of stillness that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. In that moment, the clearing felt less like a discovery and more like a conclusion. He thought about the people who had brought the wagon here so long ago, about the decision they had made to leave the barrels intact, to remove them from circulation without destroying them. Perhaps they had intended to return. Perhaps they had hoped the world would change in ways that would make their findings acceptable. Or perhaps they had simply recognized that not every answer demanded action. Whatever their reasons, their choice had echoed forward in time, intersecting with his own in a way that felt neither coincidental nor destined. It felt, instead, like continuity. The administrative process continued into the new year, then slowed further. Temporary designations became extended ones. Reviews were postponed, then postponed again. Eventually, the clearing settled into a category that defied easy resolution. It was acknowledged, documented, and quietly set aside. Not preserved in the celebratory sense, but protected through inattention. Ethan received no commendations. There were no acknowledgments of initiative or foresight. His work was noted as compliant, thorough, unremarkable. That, too, was a form of success. In a system that rewarded visibility, invisibility could be a shield. As spring returned, the forest renewed itself with familiar insistence. New growth filled gaps left by winter, and the clearing absorbed the season without change. The wagon remained, weathered and steady. The barrels stayed sealed, their purpose unresolved. Ethan resumed his routine fully, the clearing now integrated into his understanding of the land rather than standing apart from it. He no longer felt the need to monitor it constantly. It had found its place, not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be respected. One afternoon, while completing a routine patrol, Ethan paused at the edge of the forest and looked back toward the direction of the clearing, though it was far beyond sight. He considered how easily the outcome could have been different, how a single report, filed too quickly or framed too directly, might have triggered a chain of events no one could stop. How disclosure, once unleashed, often served interests indifferent to consequence. He understood then that his role had never been to decide what the barrels meant. It had been to decide when meaning should be imposed at all. The forest offered no affirmation, no sign that his choice had been correct. It continued to grow, decay, and renew itself as it always had. But in that indifference lay a quiet validation. The land had not been altered to satisfy urgency. It had been allowed to remain itself. As Ethan turned back to his work, he carried with him a simple understanding. Some truths did not ask to be uncovered. They asked to be held in place, protected not by secrecy or force, but by restraint. Not everything hidden was meant to be revealed. And sometimes, the most responsible act was to recognize when to stop. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and new stories like this one. Watch our other videos to explore more discoveries, choices, and consequences hidden beneath the surface. And if this story made you think, share it with someone who would appreciate it too.